Did he get physically hurt?
No. He didn't get touched. Got roughed up a little bit, but there was no physical harm.
Wait. So I guess everybody's talking about this now on YouTube. But there was this guest on the Joe Rogan podcast who came on as a criminal justice reform advocate, presenting himself as someone who was wronged by the justice system. And then only a month later, he is arrested in connection with a brutal murder, decapitation, a headless torso being found in this apartment building, and him being brought in on charges. So the question here today is, could we see any warning signs of this potential behavior when we look back at this interview now? And I first want to say that I'm clearly looking in retrospect. I did not watch this episode or listen to it when it came out. And so I will have to say that there's the caveat that I'm only looking now knowing that these extreme charges were brought against this individual. But it is worth pointing out that even immediately after this podcast, there were people, as soon as this podcast came out, that expressed serious doubts about the story that was presented on the podcast. I mean, here you have a guy from the Joe Rogan Experience Reddit talking about how this guy was a textbook thug. Some guys spend all of their time in prison creating a perfect story of how the justice system did them wrong and how what they did wasn't deserving of their punishment, but they leave out or recontextualize all of the parts of their story which make them look bad. They are also hardened gang leaders and criminals, as Johnson was so often good at manipulation. His life story, he told Joe, was packed full of appeals to emotion instead of valid explanations. And then now you have someone commenting on this more recently. You were certainly right. So this comment was an example of someone who, in the moment, recognized some red flags, right? And the things he's pointing out, this commenter, do include certain traits of antisocial personality disorder. So the fundamental feature of antisocial personality disorder is a lack of empathy, and that lack of empathy then enables the types of Machiavellian or predatory interactions with society. That's really what the antisocial means. It's not that they're removed from society. That would be like avoidant or schizoid types of personality disorders. Antisocial means they're sort of in opposition to society. They are predatory towards society, and everything is about their own personal gain and essentially using people to their own personal gain. So the appeals to emotion is a way of getting people on their side so that they can benefit. And the manipulation is something you definitely see in antisocial. It's even a diagnostic criteria, manipulativeness. Now, the other thing this commenter says is, I have serious qualms with Dubin and how he operates. So he's referring to Josh Dubin, who was the lawyer and criminal reform advocate that brought on Sheldon Johnson Jr. So Josh Dubin has actually been a guest on the Joe Rogan Experience in the past and has brought in cases of wrongful accusation or wrongful conviction to sort of highlight the problems in the criminal justice system. In this case, he brought on Sheldon Johnson Jr., who everyone agrees was guilty of some violent crimes, but we'll see they're presented as being these minor offenses that he was essentially persecuted for unfairly by the justice system. And so here's how Josh Dubin describes Sheldon Johnson Jr. during this podcast episode.
It's pretty astounding how he was treated by the system. Another miracle sitting to my right, just like a marvelous human being who was basically told by a judge, by an African-American judge, that you don't matter, you don't count, and I'm going to throw your life away for a crime in which the victim received 2 stitches.
And you were in for 25
years and 5 months.
Certainly these comments did not age well, given that it was, not even a year of being out of prison before Sheldon Johnson was arrested for murder.
For a crime in which the victim received 2 stitches.
So what Josh Dubin and Sheldon Johnson keep referring to as the 2 stitches incident was actually Sheldon Johnson robbing someone who owed him money, a man and his girlfriend, with the help of a gang of accomplices. Somebody in the gang pistol whipped the victim, leaving him with a head wound. But now the 2 stitches part is what we hear about on Joe Rogan.
The victim received 2 stitches.
And you were in for 25?
25 years and 5 months.
For 2 stitches.
2 stitches.
Jesus.
And I want to make clear one thing that has always struck me about Sheldon is his vulnerability, but also his honesty. He's like, he'll be the first to tell you out of the gate, I did it. He's not asking for a pass based on his conditions. What he's always said to me was, I just want people to consider how it may have impacted me. To me, you just can't ignore it. It doesn't say, well, poor Sheldon. I think that because I guess, I know him, the human being.
Josh Dubin here is saying the way Sheldon talks about it, he takes accountability. He just says, I want people to consider how X, Y, and Z might have affected me. It's not about saying, poor me. But then Josh Dubin has to admit, well, I sort of think of it like poor Sheldon, i.e., I do sort of pity him, but it's not because he told me to think that way. It's because of what I see. And so showing that, to me, Josh Dubin sounds like the victim of successful manipulation, right? Because successful manipulation is about making the person think it was their idea, right? So Josh Dubin is saying, I'm the one who realized I should feel sorry for this guy. He never told me to feel sorry for him. But in fact, so let's hear from his own words. What does Sheldon Johnson say happened with that prior battery? Does he take accountability? Let's see.
And when I saw him, he had a bunch of jewelry on. He was with his girlfriend. She had a bunch of jewelry on. I said, hey, man, where's my money at? Oh, I was going to pay you. So I robbed him. And I took his jewelry. And his girlfriend happened to be there. And unfortunately, she got caught up in the situation. I had a bunch of young guys with me, and they robbed her as well.
So the selective use of the passive voice, I would say, is something to pay attention to when, if you're considering whether someone is potentially antisocial. If it seems like there are times when things just happened, as opposed to I did things, that is an almost unconscious manipulation on the person's point. It probably was conscious at some level, but they're so used to just seeing the world in a way that they are always blameless, that if it's anything that would be potentially derogatory towards them, they're going to automatically go into the passive voice. So the girl that the guy who owed him money, he's already talking like deserved the beating because he owed him money. But with the girlfriend, unfortunately, she got involved.
Unfortunately, she got caught up in the situation. I had a bunch of young guys with me, and they robbed her as well. And he got hit in the head with the gun right here on the side of his head, and he got 2 stitches.
It wasn't even that she got involved. It was that she got caught up in the situation, unfortunately. And he had a bunch of young guys with him, so it was their age. Maybe that's why it happened. All he knows is that it happened. He had no role in it as far as he's concerned.
And they gave me 25 years for that case. Like I said, we go back to morals and values and principles and how warped they can be, right? In my mind at the time, this is a guy who I gave something to. He's living an illegal life. I'm living an illegal life. So as far as I was concerned at that time, it was fair game. In hindsight, as I moved on and I became more mature and I began to reevaluate myself, I realized how wrong that was. But that was later on.
Why was it wrong is what I would have asked if I had been Joe Rogan in this situation, because he's still talking like it was a totally fair game kind of situation. And then he says, in retrospect, in hindsight, I realized it was wrong. But why? Is he even able to defend that notion or give any kind of explanation for why it's wrong? I'm not sure he can.
Another guy that I ran into, he also owed me some money. He owed me $7,000, and it kind of went along the same ways. He was selling drugs out of an auto parts store. Reading in between the lines and outside the margins without really going into all of the details, I robbed him because he owed me $7,000.
Okay, so here's another thing that he got caught up in, I guess, right? And this was left out originally. Originally, it was 25 years just for that one battery case. Oh, it turns out, well, there was another robbery, but this guy owed him $7,000. So what happened with that one?
Did he get physically hurt?
No. He didn't get touched. Got roughed up a little bit, but
Wait,
there was no physical harm.
wait. So Josh Dubin, very much like an attorney, asks a leading question. Did he get hurt? No, he didn't get touched. He got roughed up a little bit, but
Did he get physically hurt?
No, he didn't get touched. Got roughed up a little bit, but there was no physical harm. Nothing. Back to morals and values and principles, right? In my mind, he was fair game.
getting roughed up a little bit doesn't sound like nothing to me. But in my mind, it was fair game. Is it still fair game though?
He's selling drugs. I'm selling drugs. You owe me money. I came to take what you have. In that world, that was considered as permissible. These are one of the rules of something that was permissible in that world. Long story short, in December 1997, I get arrested. He just called me a menace to society, and he gave me 50 years.
So again, nothing there that sounds like remorse, right? And remorse is sort of it's a specific type of empathy, right? Remorse is a retrospective empathy about something you have done. So to feel remorse is to feel for the people whom you have wronged with your past actions, right? Empathy is a more general concept. It's more often a present moment kind of emotion. You feel empathy for other people, which means you care what happens to them or what is happening to them. Remorse is, I now see or feel how this person must have felt when I did whatever action, right? So it's a retrospective, personally directed empathy. But the way he's talking is, again, other than saying, I see it was wrong, it sounds totally like he's justifying his actions, which is not consistent with regretting or having remorse about them.
I left the gangs alone, which was a benefit for them because, I was what you call an authoritarian. I was a rule guy. I'm still a rule guy. I like rules. I like rules. I like structure. I like things to be a certain way. And it was to their advantage to get rid of me anyway.
Wait.
Plus, I knew a lot of the guys who were at the top.
Why was it to their advantage to get rid of you?
Because
Okay, yeah, that's exactly the same question I would have. When he says, it was in the gang's interest to get rid of me, I could interpret it as either there was a rival gang member that wanted to get rid of him, and that's what he's implying here, that he got pushed out because of a power struggle. But the other option is it was to their advantage to get rid of me because I was mistreating them or, I was a menace to my own gang. And I really don't know what he means here.
and it was to their advantage to get rid of me anyway. Plus, I knew a lot of the guys who were at the top.
Why was it to their advantage to get rid of you?
Because I was the type of person who would say, you doing that for what reason? Nah, you can't do that. The rule says that you can't do this, you can't do this. This is what the rules say.
So because he would enforce the rules, it was to their advantage to get rid of him. To me, it sounds like he's admitting that he would institute extremely harsh punishments of some sort if people broke the rules, right? And yet he's still defending even that as, I'm a rules guy. It's important to me that things are in order. But it's sort of like admitting that the gang probably did not appreciate his authoritarian discipline style, right? I don't know what else it would be. So then the point in the podcast where I think the utter lack of empathy comes out to its greatest degree is when Sheldon Johnson Jr. is talking about his son being convicted for manslaughter. And he's, again, using the story to kind of make a point about how harsh the system is, how unfair it is, that if you make one mistake, it'll ruin your whole life. Look at what happened to his son. That's the way he presents it. But the tone of it, give this a listen, right?
Like my son, when he got into a fight with an Asian guy. They called him the Columbia Law student killer, right? He gets into a fight with this Chinese guy. And this is not to take away anything from that man's family. And, as a man, as his father, I felt some type of way. But the guy goes into the street and gets hit by a car and he dies. But this is how fast your life can change from just one simple mistake. From one mistake. And I just feel like, a lot of times these conditions are created and there's really there's no alternatives.
So elsewhere, Johnson had written about this incident committed by his son, saying that his son was 14 years old at the time. This was in 2008 when the Columbia graduate student was killed. And Sheldon has said his son was trying to impress a group of friends. So that's one account. Here's the New York Times account from 2008. A Columbia University graduate student was hit and killed by a vehicle while trying to escape an assault. So he was on the median up around 121st and 122nd. That's Harlem. That's pretty near the Columbia graduate schools. A small group of young men drew near and one attacked him. So that would have been Sheldon Johnson III, I guess. It's the son of Sheldon Johnson Jr. Mr. Yu struggled and broke free and ran across one southbound lane. So as he was being assaulted, it sounds like he's trying to sort of stumble away, and then he's hit by an SUV and dies. So it was ultimately second-degree manslaughter. But to hear Sheldon Johnson tell it now, there was this fight. My son got in a fight with a Chinese guy, and then he went and got hit by a car. And again, this was a very promising individual, a PhD student in statistics who now has a conference in his memoriam. And so I do think this telling really was the biggest red flag that came out of this whole podcast. Just no sense of the humanity of this guy, only the sense in which his son, who I believe he's seeing as an extension of himself, and so it's sort of the same kind of ego protective mechanism of it's the world's fault, it's not my fault, it wasn't my son's fault, it's the system's fault, as if this was just done to him, completely ignoring, not just downplaying in this case, but ignoring the actual role. And you can somewhat contrast Sheldon Johnson's own father. It does seem his father has some willingness to take responsibility. So here in this Daily Mail article, killer in a wig accused of murdering NYC man and chopping up his body, cozies up to Manhattan DA, etc. It does say his family's multi-generational criminal history has been unearthed since his charge, including his deaf, drug-dealing father and son. In the article, we have Johnson's father says he is to blame for his son's criminal past, which saw him employ his young son to translate drug deals through sign language. But the father says, I know that my son was a good kid growing up. We never had a good relationship. I'm still shocked this happened. I can't believe it. But then he felt his actions instilled a behavior that not only ruined his son's life, but carried through to Johnson Jr.'s son, also called Sheldon Johnson. So the third there. The youngest Johnson made headlines in 2008 when he was arrested on manslaughter charges as a 14-year-old for a random attack on a Chinese Columbia University graduate. He punched the graduate student in the head multiple times in the streets of Harlem, which caused Yu to fight for his life and run for safety. So again, the father, Johnson Sr., saying, generation to generation, it all stems from me. And that was actually back in 2016. I feel disappointed. I regret a lot of the decisions I made in life. It enters my mind all the time, a big, huge amount of guilt. I ruined everything. I don't know if I want to say whether the father is right that he caused it, but I imagine growing up in this environment where he was learning criminality from his father certainly could have contributed to antisocial personality developing. There always is, though, the question of how much is nature and how much is nurture, and there's always the answer that it's both. But again, it's a major contrast to my mind, how Johnson Sr. talks and how Johnson Jr. talks in this Joe Rogan interview, the difference in empathy. This Daily Mail article on the whole is definitely kind of a doozy. We have a criminal justice advocate turned suspected killer in a wig. So that's Sheldon Johnson Jr. A criminal justice advocate turned suspected killer in a wig was snapped with Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, so a picture was taken, and used sign language to help his deaf child rapist dad carry out drug deals as a child. I didn't actually know that rape was, I guess, among the father's rap sheet. Yeah, okay. I mean, you do have to wonder about sort of bad seeds, right? And a tree being judged by its fruit. We know this part. Sheldon Johnson told Joe Rogan a month ago how he'd turned his life around after 2 violent robberies and a jail sentence. The justice reform advocate and former drug dealer was given 50 years behind bars for armed robbery before rising the ranks of a prison gang. Right, so there, the fact that he is actually rising through the ranks of a gang in prison, what does that speak to? I mean, for one, it sort of speaks to an unwillingness to give up on the sort of gang hierarchy lifestyle. And for two, that I guess he was successful at this lifestyle, right? So that's the kind of superficial charm, manipulativeness. Those are the other things that enable antisocial behavior to a pathological degree, right? The lack of empathy enables it, but also superficial charm enables it. You know, you have to be able to be Machiavellian, to use people. It's not that easy, right? You have to be good at it to be able to actually to do it. Johnson has since been arrested in connection to discovery of a dismembered body of Colin Small, 44, in a Bronx apartment. So Sheldon Johnson Jr. got out of prison in May of 2023 and is here shown posing with the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg. So speaking of being successful at superficial charm, I mean, within a year of getting out of prison for multiple violent offenses, this guy is able to cozy up to the Manhattan DA and then get on the biggest podcast in the world, maybe? I mean, Joe Rogan's a huge podcast, right? So it does say something for this guy's ability to manipulate the system that, you know, if you want to manipulate the system for a cause, a supposed cause, getting on Joe Rogan in itself is a measure of success. So this is the victim, Colin Smalls, 44, who was murdered in his Bronx apartment. Here is a suspect alleged to be Sheldon Johnson walking in and out of the Bronx apartment, having donned a blonde wig in an apparent attempt at disguise. So he regaled Rogan's audience with tales of his rise to the top of one of the prison's most notorious gangs before insisting it was all behind him. Right, so you can definitely appreciate the Daily Mail's presentation of this now in hindsight. Certainly, this sentence is kind of tell me you don't believe it without telling me you don't believe it, right? He regaled Rogan's audience with tales of his rise to the top before insisting it was all behind him. So a quote from Johnson: "I've been doing bad for so long, I'm going to try to do something good. If all else fails, I can go back to doing something bad." This does not sound like successful reformation. This does not sound like he is ready for reintegration to society. He's saying, well, I'll try being good. If it fails, I can just go back to being bad. And of course, we know how it ended tragically. But so lawyer Josh Dubin, a guest on the podcast, praised Johnson as a miracle and argued that Johnson's decades behind bars were unfair as he left a victim with only 2 stitches. Right, so that point again. Now, so Josh Dubin, I'm going to say that for Josh Dubin, I think he fell prey to the hammer nail fallacy. At least that's what I'm going to call it. I don't know if there's a more proper term for this fallacy, but it's the idea that when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so Josh Dubin has made a career out of being a civil rights attorney and then an advocate for criminal justice reform. And so his hammer has become getting people who were unfairly prosecuted or penalized out of prisons. You know, he sees the world as a place where criminal justice is unfair, right? So, and he's been very successful at that, right? So he's good with that hammer. But then what happens is he's especially prone to fall victim to the manipulations of somebody like this. And, you know, we're all subject to this fallacy. I mean, certainly in psychiatry, there are major difficulties separating yourself from the lens through which you start seeing it. When you specialize in psychiatry, say, you know, there's definitely people out there who they see so much trauma and the effects of trauma so much that any kind of mental distress they're going to explain as being trauma related. Incidentally, that trauma argument is something I think we're going to end up seeing. The New York Daily News has already come out with this article about the suspects in the Bronx Headless Torso case being abused at a group home as a child. And so we have this account of abuse and molestation. But I'm just going to say, if the only source of that account is Sheldon Johnson Jr., I'm going to wait on believing that. But certainly that may be an argument we see in this case. There's other things in psychiatry too. I don't just want to point at the kind of trauma lens. There's also the kind of forever conflict in psychiatry between the biological and the psychological. I might do a whole video on that at some point, but people that see everything in the kind of psychodynamic or kind of personality-based things where, you know, therapy would be the only appropriate thing to do. And then there's people that see everything as biological, essentially a problem with neural signaling or plasticity. And so medications or other interventions that are biological would make sense. Everyone has their hammer, and so everyone sees their nails. But I do think that's what happened with Josh Dubin in this case.
So as far as I was concerned at that time, it was fair game. At this time, I committed the crime, and I just kept moving. Another guy that I ran into, he also owed me some money. He owed me $7,000, and it kind of went along the same ways. He was selling drugs out of an auto parts store. He was a Spanish guy. I got word that this is where he was at, and he was selling drugs, and I was going to get my money. And the same circumstances kind of ensued.
So the same circumstances kind of ensued, right? So that's the passive voice. I didn't do anything. The circumstances happened. They kind of ensued. So some other things we can see from the interview. One is the way he presents the plea deal as being ridiculous. He says that my lawyer told me the max sentence was 25 years, but the plea deal would have been 23 years. So I thought, what's the point? If it's only a 2-year difference, I should risk trial.
Both cases, really for one of them, for the one with the guy and the girl. And then the other case drops with the auto parts store, the guy that I said that was selling drugs out of the auto parts store. My final offer before trial was 23 years, which kind of blew me away because my lawyer kept telling me that my maximum sentence was 25 years if I went to trial. So in my mind, it just didn't make no sense to me. Why would I forfeit my rights to an appeal if there's only a 2-year difference? I told the judge I would take 15 years right now. He refused to accept my plea offer, and I went to trial, and then I ended up getting 50 years. 5-0. And
So they give you 25 for each case? Is that
25 for each case.
So there we do have Joe Rogan, I think, showing a little bit of skepticism about the way the info is being presented, right? Because he's basically clarifying, okay, so 25 years was the max sentence. You got an offer for a 23-year plea, but instead you got the max sentence for each of the two assaults he was on trial for. Which honestly, if he had taken the plea, he probably would have gotten out in 15 years. So I don't really think his decision-making process was about the logic or lack thereof of taking 23 years instead of 25. I think he didn't want to plead, because he thought he wasn't responsible for these actions. He thought he was entitled to get out of it. So he's now saying, oh, it wouldn't have made sense to do the plea, but really, it doesn't sound like there was that much misrepresentation here. I mean, he got the max sentence for both, and then he got out on parole in half the time, right? He got out in 25 years.
And I remember when he said 50 years. He said he went into all of these reasons why he was sentencing me the way that he was sentencing me. There was never no post. There was never no. They're supposed to do a report prior to your sentencing, and it's called a post-supervision interview. Pre-sentencing investigation. It's called the PSI, pre-sentencing investigation. There was never no pre-sentencing investigation. There was never no mitigating evidence presented on my behalf to, highlight why I may have made some of the decisions that I made. And he just called me a menace to society, and he gave me 50 years.
Right. So everything was unfair, right? Anything that had a negative effect on him was unfair for some reason. It's not to say you can't make these arguments, but if this is your focus, if your focus is the problems with the justice system, once you get out of a long prison system, it doesn't sound like you spent that time thinking about what you could do differently. It doesn't sound like you sort of sat with the confessional spirit of being in prison. It doesn't sound like you focused on reforming yourself at all, right? If you're purely focusing on reforming the criminal justice system, but the flip side of that is the criminal justice system is all that was wrong in this case. I didn't do anything wrong in this case. So that being his focus, to me, does not bode well for, having had a successful rehabilitation.
Because I was in a gang, and I was top of the food chain. I had my own nation. I wasn't just like the random gang member. I had a whole nation under me. And I was just in and out the box, solitary confinement, which has been considered as unconstitutional now. And I remember just having these moments of reflection and just asking myself, like, what are you gonna do? Can you spend the next 48 years living like this? And I said I couldn't do it. And I had lost all my privileges. They took everything from me. I was in Southport at the time, which is closed now. It's a solitary confinement facility in New York State. And I was on a loaf, which is also unconstitutional now. So the loaf is a dietary restriction that they give you. It's a chunk of bread, and it has cabbage and carrots in it, and they give.
So in his account, to me, it sounds like the part he's the most proud of is having the whole nation under him. That's in prison gang terms, and the rest of what he talks about is how unconstitutional his punishment was.
And I was on a loaf, which is also unconstitutional now. And it has cabbage and carrots in it, and they give you like a quarter of a cabbage, and they give you a cup of milk. When they can't take any more of your privileges, this is what they would give you. 6 days out the week, on the 7th day, you would get a hot meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then it would go back for 21 days. They would do this 6 and 1, 6 and 1, 6 and 1. And it was at that moment where I really said, I have to change my life.
So when we think about the cluster B disorders, there can be a lot of shared features, right? Things like having a kind of inflated or grandiose ego or needing a lot of ego validation. That happens in borderline, that happens in narcissistic, that happens in histrionic, and it happens in antisocial. All of them want that kind of ego, they're all of them are a bit narcissistic. It's just narcissistic is the one that's defined by that need for ego validation. But you see like a narcissistic tendency in all of them. Borderline is defined by more so the instability of emotions, instability of concepts, instability of attachments. And so the primary need is not actually the ego validation, it's the reassurance of non-abandonment, the reassurance that someone will not abandon them. And so ego validation in their case is more about whether it fills that need. In histrionic, it's about attention. It's about being the center of attention and having people look at you and pay attention to you. And so the ego validation is as part of being the star on a stage, right? And in antisocial, the ego validation is part of the primary need, which is selfish gain, right? So, and you can also define it by the deficit. The deficit is the lack of empathy. So that the defining features of antisocial are lack of empathy and need for selfish gain. And really it's the deficit, the lack of empathy, that makes that selfish gain what it is. Because, I don't know if you ever heard this argument, but you could say that, well, even altruism is selfish because people are just doing altruistic acts because it makes them feel good. But I would say that that's not really what selfish is then. Like if you want to define this all as pursuing our self-interest, fine. But if someone's self-interest includes feeling good when they do something good for someone else, that's unselfish. If it makes you feel good to do things for others, that's good. That's what it means to be unselfish, that you care about other people. So in antisocial personality, the lack of empathy makes the natural tendency towards self-interest, i.e. wanting to do things that make you feel good, all only selfish things, only focused on the self, because there's no effect of things happening to other people. All that things happening to other people mean for an antisocial person is they're getting something that I'm not getting, right? And so the thing that makes him want to reform, quote unquote, is that he's not getting the hot meals for most of his time in jail at a certain point. And so that's when he says, I can't live like this. I'm not getting the things that I want, right? And so that's what I would call the antisocial form of selfishness.
And at that time, this is where a lot of the what they call set tripping began. The organization began to implode on itself.
The gang organization.
The gang organization. There was a lot of infighting, sets against sets, and I was just always against that. And it was time for me to go, and I didn't care whatever the consequences was. I was fortunate that there weren't any consequences, but I didn't care what the consequences was. I just walked away.
And then that begins your journey.
This begins my journey. I got into school. I got my GED. From there, I got involved in...
So in this podcast episode, it sounds to me like Sheldon Johnson would be happy just talking about the gang life stuff almost the whole time, the prison gangs in particular. But then we have Josh Dubin leading him. So you're going to talk about then your new life, right?
I just walked away.
And then that begins your journey.
This begins my journey. I got into school. I got my GED. From there, I got involved in correspondence courses. I started interacting with guys who were teaching ART, aggression replacement training, and I started to begin to understand how these concepts work, what positive visualization is, deep breathing, how to remove.
So remember, the concern always is when you're teaching therapeutic techniques to someone who you suspect has antisocial personality, are you actually just teaching them new ways to convince people of their own good and strategies to manipulate people? We always hope the answer is no, but I'm not sure we've done a great job at figuring out how to ensure that we're not just enabling people with antisocial personality in particular, that we're not enabling them to kind of convince people that they're now mentally healthy. But again, I'm going to say, I'll just give the caveat that I am subject to having a hammer and thinking everything is a nail as well, right? So as of this point, Sheldon Johnson Jr. has not been convicted of this new murder charge, right? He has been convicted of prior felonies, including violent offenses. And I'm saying that I am seeing signs that look like antisocial from certain things he's saying in this interview. But I'm going to admit that I may be biased now. The lens I'm looking at this through may be biased both from the sensationalist stories that I've seen here recently and my own tendency to look for sort of cluster B qualities in people, particularly in a forensic type of context like this one, because I think those things are generally underdiagnosed. But he has not been convicted for this, and who knows what could come out in trial, right? I would say if he is convicted and receives another long prison sentence, that is still another opportunity for real self-reflection. You know, another thing I want to talk about at some point in the future is when and to what extent are cluster B personality disorders curable? You know, what can get better and how often does it? But I'm out of time right now for making this video. As always, I thank you for your attention, and to all of those who are supporting me in this endeavor, thank you for allowing me to speak.